Hi, I'm Gillian Polack, and I would like to read you my paper, The Problem of Australia, or The Tyranny of Distance. I begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I present this paper today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending this conference. I've broken my paper into two sections, one for now and one for the conference itself. Together, they answer the questions I posed in the abstract, which is how distance and its costs, the role of income, and the capacity to cross cultural divides can shape the way Australian writers are seen in the US. It will ask whether the pandemic has changed this for individual writers. I'm only talking about novels here. Shorter fiction has much broader parameters and very different publishing history and access. My two papers do not, however, use the same approach. Why? There are many ways of seeing and describing Australian speculative fiction. One of the most standard is to seek individual significant writers. One such is Greg Egan, who speaks with an international voice outside Australia. There are also significant writers who speak with a particular style of acceptable Australian voice within Australia. That acceptable voice was once aligned with the writing of Patrick White, with Terry Dowling, with John O'Grady. Patrick White is seldom described as a speculative fiction writer. Terry Dowling is almost always described as a speculative fiction writer. And John O'Grady never was one. John O'Grady, nevertheless, is the writer I'll return to in a moment. In this pre-paper, I want to talk about belonging and about Australian speculative fiction writers in relation to our entry into New Narnia, where New Narnia is US publishing. I also want to talk about how our science fictional literary history has shaped who we are and given us a very odd and warped and often limited access to US markets. Australia's literary history is one of the reasons we have those three groups of writers, those that belong to both the US and to Australia, those that pass as international, and those that are best known locally in Australia. Our voices are changing, and there are different definitions of an Australian voice now, according to which literary circles one mixes with and which scholarly circles are pulling together the proper interpretation. Putting these complexities aside, let me return to John O'Grady. John O'Grady is better known in Australia by a pseudonym, Nino Culotta. His 1957 book, They're a Weird Mob, translates Australian culture into a comic novel by telling the story through the eyes of an Italian journalist who's moved to Australia. The novel is a process of translation, and through the translation, the narrator, Nino, becomes more Australian. What kinds of Australian voices we have in the speculative fiction world are far less important to the US market than whether the US is comfortable with them. One way to achieve comfort is to have a Nino Culotta translate them successfully. Another is the method where US narrative norms dominate and Australian aspects are at most colour. This applies to nearly all Australian writers who achieve significant success in the US. Keep this in mind, for it's one of the reasons the Susan metaphor is effective. It all comes down to translation and comfort. And John O'Grady is my secret code for one of the forms translation and comfort can take in fiction. Australia generally measures its writers differently to the US. There are some exceptions to this. Whenever a critic has strong US links, they will adopt US modalities, and the way they explain literature will follow that modality. In the field of speculative fiction, Jonathan Strahan best exemplifies this bicultural approach. It affects what writers are visible and where and how that visibility translates within Australia and outside Australia. Within Australia, there's also the issue of our rather notorious, at least in our own mind, cultural cringe and our distrust of people with too much talent unless they're doing sport. It's easier for us to describe it as a tall poppy syndrome than to accept the conflict between this need to cut outstanding success down to size and the deep wish of many Australian speculative fiction writers to be visible and successful internationally. This conflict helps us undermine our own literary reputations, but that's another topic. To me, this all links with the problem of Susan. In a notorious scene in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, belonging is linked to distance, emotional distance, religious distance. Susan lives in a far country and is no longer part of her family. Most Australian speculative fiction writers are Susans, technically part of the international US culture-based family, but in reality only included where we can make the right kinds of leaps, physical, intellectual, and cultural. The exceptions are writers such as Jack Dan, whose significant US career predated his life in Australia, or Justine La Balestier, who has a history of living both in New York and Sydney. This group of writers is, in Narnia terms, Peter, Edmund, or Lucy, kings and queens. Then there's a group of writers who have mastered writing in an international mode, or rather in genre terms that suit the American market. The Jill Poles, I shall call them. This is because I want to make the joke that Gillian Polack is not herself a Jill Pole. While not Peter or Edmund or Lucy, the Jill Poles still belong to Narnia. They've mastered the speech patterns or write specifically to the type of SF genre that's fashionable in New York publishing. There are sufficient numbers so they can be described as typical or representative of Australian writers by any who don't understand the sheer diversity of Australian speculative fiction, nor its peculiar parameters. Trudy Canavan, Garth Nix, Shaun Williams, Kate Forsyth, they all fit into this group. They're all Jill Poles. Shaun Williams actually demonstrates the parameters of the group rather well, because some of his work is better known internationally than other. The other is the writing that's placed clearly and without question in Australia proper, that addresses issues specific to Australia. In Shaun's case, it's his series about the wide brown land itself. It's academically not at all proper to refer to my own work, but my own work is actually at that borderline that helps us see where the US accepts Australian writers and how Australian writers are accepted. Because of my academic background, I can give papers such as this one. Because I'm fairly well published, my name appears on award lists and in journal contents in places like Locus. Because my voice is very Australian, there are few or no reviews or essays about my work in these places. That's a bit sparse in terms of US visibility for 10 novels. It's even sparser when you consider that I was the 2020 A. Bertram Chandler Award winner for Lifetime Achievement in Science Fiction. I also write about the wide brown land, but in a more mimetic way than Shaun Williams. Many Australian writers are fascinated with our own country, and very few views of that country are widely visible in the US. Let me talk briefly about the role of the wide brown land in Australian writing. That description, wide brown, comes from a Dorothy McKellar poem, while my favourite McKellar adjectives describe an opal-hearted country, a willful, lavish land. The wide brown aspect is the one that provokes much speculative fiction. It's critically important to how Australians describe ourselves and became part of our self-description at a time when we accepted that colonisation had an end date and that we were self-governing. We're still enmeshed in issues relating to colonisation, and our relationship with the US is part of this. Access to the US for Australians is partly achieved by knowing your culture and sublimating ours. While McKellar's poem was directed to Britain and reflects our history and a time when we saw ourselves through English eyes, it applies to now because our entry into the US cultural zone is part of a deep shift. McKellar wrote, "The love of field and coppice, of green and shaded lanes, of ordered woods and gardens is running in your veins. Strong love of grey-blue distance, brown streams and soft dim skies. I know but cannot share it. My love is otherwise. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons. I love her jewel sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. It was first published in the early 20th century, around the time that Australia was besotted with lost land adventures and Gothic romance and bush tales and tales of England. Most Australian novels were published in London at that time, and their first market was the UK, then Australia, and then the British Commonwealth. I like to think of Australia as one of the home counties among the Commonwealth countries, and certainly in literary terms, this was true for a very long time. After World War II, and especially since the 1980s, we began to develop a similar relationship with the US. However, the diversity of Australian voices didn't transfer smoothly from London to New York. Some significant cultural differences have become clear, and only certain types of Australian speculative fiction have ever fitted comfortably in the core of US publishing. The US-Australia relationship is more one-sided than the UK-Australian relationship. Our more Australian voices enter here and there, as I have, through books released by US small press and through networks of writers. Those of us who have these links often have a strong background in fandom. Fandom is our main access point. Friendships come first, then publishing enters by the back door. This is entirely different to the tracks of the best-known Australian writers in the US. Sam Hawke is someone who followed that regular path. Sam, at this moment, is with Tor, and hence a Jill Pole. Her duology is set in a secondary world and contains much politics and poison. Her writing voice is strongly international. Never forget that international normally means a focus on US narrative norms. Essentially, Sam translates effectively, far more effectively than John O'Grady's Nino Culotta. Why I called on Sam as an example is because it's very easy to compare her to a number of other speculative fiction writers from Canberra. Canberra is a compact national capital of not too many people in Mackellar's Ragged Ranges. We have the highest per capita speculative fiction writer number in any city in Australia. Karen Warren is from Canberra, as am I. Karen is also allowed into Narnia, largely because the horror field is more generous to distinctive voices that are not as American. It's not as simple as there are Peters and Lucys and there are Narnia abled and the rest of us are Susan. It comes down to who is seen as suitable for the US market, and unsuitable writers are generally ignored, even in discussions specifically about Australian writers. The US market has accepted Australian writers in principle for over 20 years now, but only certain Australian writers. Until very few years ago, Greg Egan and Damien Broderick were amongst those very few. Defining visibility brings us back to the problem Susan. Susan had different concepts of adulthood to her siblings. Essentially, she was from a different cultural background. What cultural backgrounds do we have, and why do they interfere with our visibility? We have many different types of Susan. You can find it by looking at the results of our awards system, because it shows what's acceptable and what's admired locally. Two national awards, the Aurealis and the Norma K. Hemming, best reflect our current definition of genre. They're not that tolerant of works that push boundaries right now. The Ditmar Award, on the other hand, is voted by fans. It's technically very similar to the Hugo. Fans in Australia can support very normative genre. Garth Nix won Best Novel Ditmar this year, but also can support books that are very subversive. Last year's Ditmar novel, for example. If I had 10 more minutes, I'd work my way through the many lists of the awards and show you the range of voices that are currently supported by this mixed award system. Given the time, I'll restrict myself to a couple of comments on culturally different voices. Our range of own voices is increasing in publication, but it's still harder for an Australian to reach novel publication in Australia, much less than in the US if they're from a minority, And it's also much harder to be seen by critics and in the award system. The situation in the field of short stories is much more representative. However, some culturally distinctive Australian voices are visible as award winners. Susans who are excluded from Narnia for the most part, but nevertheless respected as writers in Australia. Australia has its own views on what cultural backgrounds are appropriate for what types of writers. It doesn't necessarily reflect the same range of cultural viewpoints that are accepted in the US. The most obvious group of Susans and the most discussed, are books by Indigenous Australian writers. There are some very well-known ones, Amberlyn Quaimullen and Lisa Fuller, who's another Canberran. Only Claire G. Coleman is consistently a Jill Pole of the most important Indigenous Australian writers. And that's largely because of the particular message she put in her book, Terra Nullius, which is highly apposite to many people right now. The bottom line is that Susan is the distinctively quirky, original, and thoroughly normal Australian writer. It's easier to be seen even in Australia, however, with voices that can echo globally because we're very sensitive to US writing voices. And most bookshops here are more likely to stock US writers than Australian writers. This means that though most of us are Susans, most strongly visible writers are Jill Poles, and a very, very few Australian writers are kings and queens of Narnia. This is liable to change. The fact that I can be here at this conference delivering this paper demonstrates that Narnia is less closed. What are some of the other factors that thwart a flourishing of diverse Australian voices in the US? I look forward to talking about them at the conference.